What makes a man who already has a clear path down turn around and climb back up, back into the altitude that is already draining the life out of his friend? On the 20th of May, 2013, 11 people reached the summit of Kangchenjunga. Over the next 24 hours, 5 of them never came back. Among the dead were 2 Hungarians, a climber with a prosthetic leg and his young partner. This is the story of the darkest day on the 3rd highest mountain in the world. On the border between Nepal and the Indian state of Sikkim stands a mountain that people have never fully conquered. Its name is Kangchenjunga, 8,586 meters, the 3rd highest peak on Earth, and the only 8,000er whose true summit climbers do not actually step on by their own choice. That rule was born in 1955. That was the year the British climbers Joe Brown and George Band first made their way up the slopes of Kangchenjunga. They came almost all the way to the top and stopped just a few meters below the summit, not out of weakness and not because their strength had failed. Before they set out, they had promised the Maharaja of Sikkim that they would not disturb the gods who, according to local belief, live on that peak. And they kept their word. They never took those final steps. The tradition still holds to this day. Almost everyone who reaches the summit ridge stops just short of the true point. And here is the strange thing. A mountain that people, out of respect, have never quite finished climbing turned out to be one of the deadliest on the planet, and it kills in its own particular way. Not on the way up, when your strength is still there and the goal lies ahead. Kangchenjunga takes people on the descent. Once the summit is already won, once the euphoria has drained away, the body is empty, and any help is many hours and thousands of meters away. The reckoning comes up behind the back of the victor. The most terrible day in this mountain's history fell in the spring of 2013. In a single 24 hours, between the 20th and the 21st of May, 5 people never came back down the slopes of Kangchenjunga. At the center of that tragedy were 2 Hungarians, and an act that almost never happens in the mountains. The older of the 2 was named Zsolt Erőss. To understand what he was even doing, that high up in May of 2013, we have to rewind 45 years. He was born on the 7th of March, 1968, in Transylvania, in the small town of Miercurea-Ciuc. By blood, he was a Secali, one of the Hungarians who had lived for centuries on lands that later became part of Romania. In 1988, together with his mother and brother, he moved to Hungary, and in 1992, he became a citizen. The mountains entered his life early. He first touched rock in 1981, still a teenager, in the Baikal Gorge, an ordinary boyhood hobby that would later become everything. His first serious ascent in the big mountains came in 1990, Elbrus, the highest point in Europe. After that, his career climbed upward just as stubbornly as he himself moved up the slopes. In 2002, Erőss did what no Hungarian had ever managed before him. He climbed Everest. For a small country with no great mountains of its own, this was national news. His name became known even to people who could not have cared less about summits. He did not stop. Nanga Parbat, Gasher Broom, Dahaula Giri. The list of 8,000ers under his name grew almost every season. By the start of 2013, he had 10 of the 14 highest mountains on the planet behind him. 4 remained. He was going for the crown. All 14 8,000ers, something only a few dozen people in all of history had ever achieved. For Hungarian mountaineering, he was the #1 figure, the man everyone looked up to. And few people knew what price he had paid for the road to those final peaks. It all nearly ended at the start of 2010. And not on an 8,000er, but in far more modest mountains, in the Tatras, on the border between Slovakia and Poland. There Erőss had an accident. Little is known about exactly what happened, but the cost was brutal. He lost his right leg. It was amputated below the knee. For a high-altitude climber, a verdict like that usually means the end. An 8,000er wrings everything out of the body. Every step in the thin air comes through sheer force of will. And your balance on steep ice decides whether you live or die. To lose a leg up there means, by every rule, coming down for good. Down to your memories. Erőss refused to live by those rules. He went back to the mountains the same year he lost his leg. Where his foot had been, there was now a prosthetic. He learned to walk all over again, learned all over again how to hold his crampons on the ice, got used all over again to the fact that one leg feels the slope and the other does not. And already in 2011, he did something that is hard to believe. With his prosthetic, he climbed Lhotse, the fourth highest mountain in the world, over 8.5 kilometers. This was not even a comeback. It was an answer to everyone who had buried him. You cannot stop me. The prosthetic did not make him any more cautious. He did not look for easy routes. He did not hide behind anyone else's back. He climbed high and hard, the way he always had. Kangchenjunga was meant to be the 11th of the 14, one more step toward the crown. That season, a young partner climbed beside him, 26-year-old Peter Kiss. Back then, no one suspected that it was his name that would ring out the loudest in this story. The spring of 2013 found Kangchenjunga unusually crowded. Several expeditions from different countries were preparing for the summit push all at once. On the 20th of May, catching a weather window, several rope teams set out for the top at the same time. About 11 people reached the summit that day. For this unwelcoming mountain, an enormous number. Erőss and Kiss climbed together. The Hungarian climbed the way he had his entire career, without oxygen. At 8,500 meters, where there is 3 times less air than at sea level, not everyone is capable of that. Every breath gives the body barely a third of what it needs. The brain, the muscles, the eyesight. Everything works at its limit and slowly fades. The 2 Hungarians stood on the summit by 6 in the evening. They had made it, but time was already working against them. 6 in the evening on an 8,000er is late, dangerously late. Ahead lay the hardest part, the descent in the dark, down the very same path that had already drained almost everything out of them on the way up. Right after the summit, something began to happen to Erőss that climbers fear. He started to weaken. His movements slowed, his steps grew shorter. He began to fall behind those who were already heading down. His strength was leaving him faster than he could lose altitude. He could not make it down to a safe camp that evening. Night caught him alone, high on the slope, in the so-called death zone, above 8,000 meters at around 8,300. At that altitude, the human body does not recover. It dies. Without a tent, without oxygen, in the brutal cold and wind, a night spent alone leaves almost no chance. Somewhere lower down, in camp, his young partner knew all of this. On the morning of the 21st of May, Peter Kiss did something that goes against every survival instinct. On an 8,000er, the logic is cruel but honest. If your partner is stuck up high, in the death zone, you go down, you save yourself, climb back up, and almost certainly you both die. Kiss did the opposite. He turned around and climbed up to reach Erőss. 26 years old, his strength still with him, the path down to life right beneath his feet. And instead, he stepped the other way, back into the very altitude that was already finishing off his experienced companion. Around 9 in the morning, they were seen together. The 2 Hungarians were crawling slowly down toward the camp at 7,600. It seemed this story still had a chance to end well. And then Kiss fell. Young, strong, almost saved. He vanished on the slope in an instant. Erőss was left alone. Over the radio, he reported down that he had lost sight of his partner and did not know where he was. And he himself was getting worse and worse. First, he complained about his eyesight. Then his speech began to slip, became incoherent. That is how altitude and exhaustion slowly cloud the mind. He sat down right there on the slope and slept for several hours. And then a glimmer of hope appeared, a false one. Around 3 in the afternoon, Erőss came on the radio again. He was feeling better. His strength seemed to have come back. He was heading down toward camp. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from him. Somewhere on the way to safety, Zsolt Erőss disappeared. The radio went silent. The mountain had taken both Hungarians, the one who grew weak and the one who went back for him. And the list did not end with the Hungarians that day. Right near the summit, the Korean Park Nam-soo fell. He died just a few steps from the goal he had only just reached. And lower down, on the descent, 2 more died. Nepalis from the support teams, Fu Dorchi Sherpa, and Bibash Gurung, the men without whom almost no great climb in the Himalayas takes place, and whom the news most often does not even name. 5 people in a single 24 hours, 5 lives between the 20th and the 21st of May. The black record of Kangchenjunga. The weather takes the blame. At around 7,000 meters, a fierce wind slammed into the mountain, and at the worst possible moment, when exhausted people were already stretched out in a line heading down, with nothing left to fight the storm. The Koreans, who had lost a man of their own, still tried to search for the Hungarians. On the slope, they were able to make out only one body, that of young Peter Kiss. Erőss they never spotted. On the 22nd of May, the search was called off. The mountain would not give up its own. The mountain stayed silent for almost a year. Only in 2014, on a rock ledge at around 8,100 meters, a body was spotted. It was identified Zsolt Erőss. He had remained up there, beside the very summit that would have been his 11th. Peter Kiss was never found at all. This story quickly spread beyond the narrow world of climbers. People remembered it not because of the altitudes and not because of a list of peaks. They remembered it because of a 26-year-old who could have saved himself, and instead went back up after his companion. In the mountains, where survival almost always means going only downward, a choice like that stands apart. In 2022, a feature film about this loss was released in Hungary, told through the eyes of Erőss's widow, a woman who waited for her husband to come home and waited in vain. Kangchenjunga did once again what it always does. It let people climb up, let them touch the top of the world, and took them on the descent once the goal was already behind them. 2 Hungarians reached the very top. Not one of them came back. 8,250 meters, May of 1992. Here, on the slope of the 3rd highest mountain on Earth, the Mexican climber Carlos Carsolio sees the most decorated mountaineer on the planet alive for the very last time. She has no strength left, yet she's moving up, not down, and she decides to spend the night alone, in a hole dug into the snow, with no tent and no stove. That night, her companions far below strain their eyes until they ache, searching the slope for the glow of her headlamp. It never appears. After that night, no one will ever meet Wanda Rutkiewicz again, the first woman on K2, the first European on Everest. How could a woman like this simply vanish without a trace? A woman who conquered mountains that broke men, and all of it just a single step from her goal. On the 4th of February 1943, in the Lithuanian town of Plunge, a girl named Wanda Rutkiewicz is born. The war is still raging. Her father is an engineer and a passionate sportsman. Her mother lives for culture and music. Wanda takes half of each, the dry logic of an engineer and a hunger for the grand and the unreachable. Tragedy comes to the family early. In 1948, her younger brother Jože plays with something the war left buried in the ground. A piece of ordnance explodes. The boy is 7 years old. Wanda will carry that death with her for the rest of her life, long before she ever lays eyes on a real mountain. The family moves to the Polish city of Wrocław, and Wanda grows up on sports fields. At school, she throws the shot put, plays volleyball, runs track. Her body is strong and tireless, and it obeys. She enrolls at the Wrocław University of Technology and graduates as an electrical engineer, a precise profession with no room for chance. And then everything turns on chance. In 1961, a chance meeting on the street introduces her to a climber named Bogdan Jankowski. He takes her to the cliffs, and there, this engineering student from an industrial city feels for the first time something that has no formula. The heights answer her. The rocks quickly stop being a weekend pastime. At first, it really is just a hobby, trips to the cliffs, training on weekends. But Wanda doesn't do anything halfway. The mountains push everything else aside and become, all at once, both her work and her faith. The little girl from war-torn Plunge begins her long road upward. 15 years or so go by, and the name Rutkiewicz is known far beyond Poland. By the end of the 1970s, she is one of the most prominent female climbers in Eastern Europe, a woman who goes where men let her in only reluctantly. Behind her lie dozens of hard ascents in the Alps and the Himalayas, and ahead of her, the highest mountain on the planet. On the 16th of October, 1978, Wanda stands on the summit of Everest, 8,848 meters. Below her, the curve of the planet. With this single step, she writes herself into history twice over. The first Pole and the first European to reach the highest point on Earth. Before her, only 2 women in the entire world had ever done it. The climb costs her more than it might look from the outside. She suffers from anemia. Her blood carries oxygen poorly. And at this altitude, that's deadly. Wanda carries iron injections with her and gives them to herself right there on the route, so she won't black out in a place where fainting means death. And she makes it. And then comes a coincidence that's almost impossible to believe. On that very same day, in Rome, the Cardinal Karol Wojtyła is elected Pope, John Paul II. For the first time, a Pole takes the throne of St. Peter. For Catholic Poland, it all ties into a single knot. On one day, the country gains its own pope and its own conqueror of Everest. Wanda instantly becomes a national symbol. Everest becomes her first 8,000er, the first step on a long road that will take up the rest of her life. The summer of 1986 finds Rutkiewicz on the slopes of K2, the second highest mountain in the world, with a reputation far more terrifying than Everest's. This pyramid in the Karakoram lets only a handful reach the top, and it takes 1 in every 4 who try to defeat it. The strongest climbers on the planet come here, and not all of them come back. On the 23rd of June, Wanda reaches the summit, the first woman in history to set foot on the top of K2, and she does it in pure style, with no oxygen bottles, in that thin air where the body slowly begins to die. For women's mountaineering, this is a frontier that for a long time was considered out of reach. But the price the mountain charges for that season is horrific. The summer of 1986 will go down as one of the darkest ever. 13 climbers die on the slopes. Among them is a French couple, Liliane and Maurice Barras. They reach the summit almost at the same time as the others, and on the descent, they vanish forever. Her record is forever linked to those 13 names. Newspapers around the world write about her, calling her the First Lady of Himalayan climbing, and with her own eyes she has seen just how thin the line is between glory and death at 8,000 meters. K2 gives her worldwide fame and a lesson she will never forget. The most dangerous part of a big climb isn't the ascent at all, when adrenaline is boiling inside you and the goal is almost within reach. The disaster comes on the way down. Your strength is drained, your focus drifts, and the mountain is still beneath your feet. The statistics are merciless. On the 8,000ers, more people die going down than going up. Wanda learns this rule better than most. The trouble is, a rule learned by heart won't be the thing that saves her. By the early 1990s, Rutkiewicz has 8 8,000ers behind her, exactly half of a crown that no woman had ever assembled. And that's when Wanda conceives a plan that's bold even by her standards. She calls it the Caravan of Dreams. The idea is simple. Climb all the remaining 8,000ers in a single push, mountain after mountain, with almost no breaks in between. Don't stretch the dream out over years. Take it by storm while the body still obeys, and become the first woman to gather the entire crown of the highest peaks. From the outside, it's a will of steel. But in the diaries of those years, a different kind of exhaustion is building up. The kind that rest doesn't cure, not a fear of heights. Something else? A heavy, draining weariness from the endless fight for respect. From a world where a female climber had to prove, again and again, her right to stand as an equal. And there are personal losses too, ones she never gets over. One by one, the people closest to her are gone. Among them, the ones she truly loved. After that, even her pull toward the summit sounds different. In the diaries, more and more clearly, you can see a longing for a peace she can't find anywhere. And still, she doesn't stop. The 9th mountain of the caravan is to be a peak on the border of Nepal and the Indian state of Sikkim, the 3rd highest on Earth. Wanda isn't going there for one more record. She's going up to a place where she can finally be alone with herself. In the spring of 1992, Rutkiewicz joins the Mexican team of a young and very strong climber, Carlos Carsolio. The logic is clear. A mountain like this is almost impossible to take solo, and the Mexicans have both the permit and the strength. On the 11th of March, they pitch base camp at the foot of the slope. The expedition's rules are loose. Each small group moves at its own pace, helps the others, but isn't roped into a single chain with them. The first summit attempt comes at the end of April and ends in retreat. The team manages to set up Camp 4, the highest camp, at around 7,900 meters. But above it, the cold rises like a wall. The frost bites at hands and feet. Several people start getting frostbite. To go any higher would mean risking too much. The group turns back. Even then, something troubling is visible. Rutkiewicz is moving noticeably slower than the rest. The young climbers manage to take shelter in a snow cave they've dug out, but Wanda doesn't make it that far. She spends the night alone at around 7,800 meters in an icy wind under the open sky. She is 49 years old. The strength that carried her to the summits for 20 years is now melting away faster. Her body can no longer keep up with the pace the caravan of dreams demands. The sensible thing would be to pull back, recover, and return later. But that's not how Wanda thinks. The ninth peak is within arm's reach, and giving it up now is unthinkable to her. The team descends to base camp to lick its wounds and wait for a weather window. Carsolio sees the state his partner is in, but he doesn't send her home. Rutkiewicz prepares for the second decisive attempt. To the exhaustion that has been building in her for years, the hunger of high altitude is now added. On the 10th of May, the team sets out on the decisive push. The snow is deep, the going is hard, and Rutkiewicz falls behind again. She spends the night lower than the others and only reaches the upper camp by the evening of the next day, dehydrated, worn out, with a broken stove. There's nothing to melt snow with, nothing to drink. You couldn't imagine a worse start for a final dash. Wanda goes anyway. On the morning of the 12th of May, she and Carsolio set out for the summit. The Mexican is younger and fresher. Little by little, he pulls ahead and, at around 5 in the evening, stands on the top. The goal is taken, and from that exact minute begins the thing Wanda has feared for 6 years, ever since K2, the way down. At about 8 in the evening, at roughly 8,250 meters, Carsolio meets her on the slope. She is still climbing upward. She has almost no strength left. Carsolio sees it at once, and then Rutkiewicz decides something that, at this altitude, is the same as a death sentence. She will not go down. She'll dig herself into the slope right here, wait out the night, and at first light cover the remaining meters to the top alone. All she has with her is a rope, a bivouac sack, and a headlamp. No stove, no fuel, no food. To stay the night without a tent at 8,200 meters in the death zone, where the body doesn't recover even in sleep, for most people, that is the end. Later, Carsolio will honestly admit it. He himself had no strength and no clear head left to talk her out of it. He goes down. In that moment, he becomes the last person ever to speak to her. And below, in the tents of the lower camp, no one sleeps all night. They're waiting for a point of light to flare up above, a sign that she's alive and moving. The black slope stays black until morning. Wanda vanishes without a trace. Her body has never been found, and in 30 years of searching, not a single trace of her has turned up on the slope. No one ever learned the one thing that matters most. Did she reach the summit of her 9th mountain that morning, or did she freeze right there in the snow hole, never making those final meters? The greatest mountaineer on the planet simply dissolved into the air of the 3rd highest mountain on Earth, a single step from her dream. But the memory of her did not dissolve. A documentary film was made about her final expedition. On her birthday, Google published a drawing in her honor. Poland declared a special year of Wanda Rutkiewicz, in memory of the girl from Plunge who walked off toward her dreams and never came back. He carried his skis to the 3rd highest peak on Earth, to ride down from it for the first time in history. On the 25th of May, 2023, the German Louis Stitzinger stands on the summit of Kangchenjunga at an altitude above 8,500 meters dikes, without oxygen, with skis strapped to his back, one step away from his dream. Around 9 in the evening, his voice sounds over the radio for the last time. Soon, you'll see my headlamp. The headlamp never lights up. 5 days later, he is found at 8,400 meters, still in his crampons, never having reached his skis. What happened during that single night between triumph and silence? On the 16th of December, 1968, in the Bavarian town of Füssen, right at the edge of the Alps, Louis Andreas Stitzinger is born. His father, Volkmar, is a well-known mountain guide, a man for whom a steep slope and deep snow were a workplace. About little Louis, the family would later say it simply, he was born with skis on his feet. For the Stitzingers, the mountains were not a hobby you take up as an adult. They were a habitat, as natural as the backyard is for other children. Louis learned to ski down a steep couloir as a child, the way others learn to ride a bicycle. Everything he would become grew out of that early schooling. not just a climber, an alpine skier of the high mountains, for whom the ascent is only half the task, while the real thing begins on the way down. Half a century later, this habit would lead him to the third highest peak on Earth, to a slope no one had ever skied. There, the dream of the descent would turn into a trap. From a quiet alpine town, the road leads Luis to the great city of Munich. At the Technical University, he studies sports science, and at LMU, he studies English. Still a student, he earns the State Certificate of Mountain and Ski Guide. What had been his surroundings in childhood now becomes his profession. Around that same time, he meets Alex von Mel, a climber who, in 2011, would become his wife. A rare partnership, husband and wife climbing 8,000ers together. They share not only a home, but the same mountains, the same camps at enormous altitude. From 1998 to 2003, Luis heads the mountaineering department of the Munich section of the German Alpine Club, then leads expeditions for a major travel club. And in 2013, in his hometown of Füssen, he opens his own company with a telling name, Go Climb a Mountain. Hobby, science, and craft come together in a single point. He becomes a professional mountaineer. What sets Stitzinger apart from thousands of strong climbers? For most of them, the summit is the finale. For Luis, it is where everything begins. He does not walk down. He skis down slopes where an ordinary person can barely stay on his feet, even in crampons. The list of his lines reads like a map of the harshest mountains on the planet. In 2006, he makes the first complete ski descent of Gasherbrum II. In 2008, he traces a descent down the center of the vast Diamir face of Nanga Parbat, where no one had ever skied before him. In 2011, together with Alex, he climbs Broad Peak in the fearsome K2, descending it by the difficult route of the Polish climber Kukuczka. By the spring of 2023, he already has 9 8,000ers and 7 ski descents from them behind him. Almost every summit he takes without an oxygen mask. He brings the bottles out only when he is leading clients up. One mountain remains, one he has not yet skied, and it is precisely this one that will become his last. That missing mountain is Kangchenjunga. On its slope there remained a clean, untraveled line. From the very top, from the summit down to the base, no human being had ever skied it. This is the line Luis set out to draw. For such a plan, the skis have to be carried up, beneath the clouds. Stitzinger straps them to his backpack and hauls them to where every extra kilogram presses down twice as hard. He is 54 years old. Kangchenjunga will be his 10th 8,000er, and once again, he climbs on his own lungs alone, without an oxygen mask. There is a bitter irony in this plan. This mountain is grimly famous for taking people not on the ascent, but on the descent, when the goal has already been reached and strength is running out. And Luis's whole plan is exactly that. A descent pushed to its limit, turned into a stunt on skis. For an alpine skier of his caliber, the idea is beautiful and logical, and hidden in that very logic is the trap. On the 25th of May, 2023, all of this still lies ahead. On this day, Luis climbs to the summit, the last of everyone who reached the top. At an altitude of about 8,586 meters, he stands alone, on the very crown of the third mountain on the planet. The goal is achieved. All that remains is to descend in the very way he came here for. On the descent, he is not entirely alone. Over the radio, Flor Cuenca stays in contact with him, a Peruvian climber who summited earlier and is now heading down. The voice on the air is the only thread connecting Luis to the rest of the world at this altitude. Cuenca is badly exhausted. The hour is late, the body asks for rest, and she does not want to go below the 4th camp. They agree, yes, she will wait for him there, in the tent at the edge of the death zone. Luis reports that he has reached the couloir, from which the descent will become easier and faster, and he promises, soon she will see the light of his headlamp crawling down the dark slope. This is the last calm minute of the entire story. An hour passes, then another. In the tent at the 4th camp, Flor Cuenca waits for the promised point of light. But the mountain is sealed shut. Fog, snow, and wind erase everything. Making out anything in that murk is impossible. The last radio signal from Stitzinger comes around 9 in the evening. In this short message, he gives his altitude as 8,200 or 8,300 meters and promises to reach the camp in about 2 hours. His voice sounds confident, like that of a man who is almost home. And then, exhaustion takes its toll. Worn out by her own climb, Cuenca cannot hold out against the waiting and falls asleep right there in the tent, under the howling wind. This is not carelessness. It is the limit beyond which the body shuts itself down. When she wakes, the air is silent. The radio is quiet. Luis does not come back on the line, and the headlamp on the slope never lit up. Between his last words and the silence that followed lay the longest night on this mountain. Dawn brings no relief. At the entrance to the tent, no one, not a familiar silhouette, not a rustle outside. Stitzinger never reached the fourth camp, even though, by his own words, only a couple of hours of travel remained. Cuenca is left alone at enormous altitude, and the dread inside her grows. To keep waiting is pointless and dangerous. She herself is at her limit. The Peruvian begins her descent, but she does not go light. She takes not only her own gear, but also Luis's belongings that remained in the camp. Every step down is harder because the load is double, and the body is already wrung dry. With every lost meter of altitude, the hope of seeing him alive fades. Somewhere above, between the summit and the tent, where he was never awaited, the vanished German remains entirely alone, cut off from everyone, above the line where the air runs out and time runs out. The news of the missing climber rolls down the mountain, to base camp, and from there onward, to the organizers and the rescuers. What had been the private dread of one exhausted woman in a tent turns into a shared disaster. Thousands of kilometers away, in Germany, his wife Alex von Melle waits for news, the woman who once stood with him on the same rope. The rescue machine begins to move. On the 28th of May, a helicopter takes off from Kathmandu with 5 rescuers aboard. But the mountains rarely let help come on schedule. Bad weather pins the aircraft to the ground, and it breaks through to the Kangchenjunga region only on the 29th. At such altitudes, the count runs not in days but in hours. While they wait below for a window in the weather, up above, not a single chance remains. Time, weather, and thin air combine into a single wall that cannot be broken through. And below, on her own, under a double load, Flor Cuenca pushes toward base. At the third camp, she waits for help from the air. In the tent at the second camp, she waits again. Again and again, she scans the sky. But it stays empty. From the second camp, she is urged to keep going down. The weather is worsening once more, and she must reach base as quickly as possible. And so she descends, worn out, alone, with another's belongings on her back, without any answer to her questions. The help she had called for never reached her. Later, Cuenca would bitterly say aloud the thing that gave her no peace. No one lifted a finger to help Luis. It is a short phrase, but within it lies the heaviest accusation of this whole story. She did what she could. She saved his gear. She carried his belongings down. But the man himself was already beyond saving, and, by her sense of it, there was no one left to save him. The answer comes only at the end of the month. On the 30th of May, a Sherpa search team climbs into the upper part of the mountain. At an altitude of about 8,400 meters, the rescuers find what they had been searching for over several days, the body of Luis Stitzinger. And one detail tells everything. He is lying still in his crampons, in those very steel teeth for the ice that he never swapped for skis. His entire plan rested on that transition, to take off the crampons, step into the skis, and trace the first line down in history. He did not live to that moment, which means the descent that was meant to enter history never even began. From that spot to the tent at the fourth camp was a stone's throw away, a short stretch that, in normal conditions, takes a couple of hours to cross. Warmth, a roof, and saving sleep were waiting right there. But the mountain stopped him here and gave up his body in the very place where the dream of the ski descent broke off. The body is flown to Kathmandu, and the doctors perform an autopsy to understand exactly what happened that night. The conclusion sounds dry: high-altitude cerebral edema and extreme exhaustion. Behind these words stands a clear picture. Worn out by many hours of climbing at the very bottom of his strength, he stopped for the night almost at the camp itself, and quietly faded in his sleep, never having covered the last few meters. Death came not in a struggle and not in a fall, but in oblivion, in the very first hours after the summit was taken. Kangchenjunga did once again what it is known for. It let the man up, allowed him to reach his goal, and turned against him exactly when the hardest part seemed to be behind him. From triumph to death, a few hundred meters of slope that he never crossed. So ends the path of a man who lived 54 years and took 10 8,000ers, almost all of them without oxygen. The descent from the summit of Kangchenjunga, which was meant to become his greatest record, remained an unfulfilled plan, a dream cut short a few meters from the first turn. But it is not the mountain that puts the final point on this story. It is someone close to him. In 2024, Alex von Mel climbs Purja, a peak that Louise had crossed back in 2021. There she scatters his ashes, fulfilling a wish he had once spoken, to remain somewhere in a far-off, deserted corner of the Himalayas, away from the trails and from the eyes of strangers. He had asked for this in his lifetime, and it came true. The story of the alpine skier breaks off far from the gleaming slope he had dreamed of. On a quiet summit, he chose himself, there, where there are no records and no spectators, only snow, silence, and the mountains he had belonged to from the very moment of his birth. 40 meters. That was the exact distance separating Benoît Chamoux from his 14th summit, the final mountain, after which he would have become the first Frenchman to conquer every giant on the planet. On the 6th of October, 1995, on the ridge of Kangchenjunga, he picks up his radio and asks someone to talk him down the way back. They hear him, they watch him reach the saddle, and then he vanishes on the northern side, together with his cameraman, Pierre, who was supposed to film this triumph. Neither of them would come back. What happened in those minutes at 8,300 meters, when victory was just one step away? Benoît Chamoux came into the world on the 18th of February 1961 in the little town of La Roche-sur-Foron at the foot of Mont Blanc. He grew up in Haute-Savoie, where snowy peaks stood outside the window from his earliest childhood. From a young age, the mountain was never an adventure for him, but a natural habitat, as familiar as the street of his hometown. He came into serious high-altitude mountaineering in the early 80s and quickly stood out among his countrymen. He had his own style, speed. Chamoux couldn't stand long sieges where a team crawls up a mountain for weeks. He climbed light and fast, getting through the dangerous altitude as quickly as possible before it wore his body out. Where others spent days, he managed in hours. That approach brought him fame. In 1986, he climbed K2, the second highest peak on the planet, in roughly 23 hours of pure climbing time. For a mountain with such a high death rate, that pace was almost unthinkable. The name Chamoux thundered through the French press. He was a star, the face of a new, light, and fast kind of mountaineering. Year after year, the speed ascents added up into a long list, and by the mid-90s, he already had 13 8,000ers behind him. He hurried to climb, hurried to live, as if he sensed that he'd been given less time than it seemed. That inner race would one day bring him beneath the third highest peak in the world, where speed would turn into a trap. By 1995, Chamoux was keeping his own count of 8,000ers, and just a single mountain stood between him and the complete list. Gathering all 14 by that point had been managed by only a handful of people on the planet, and he dreamed of standing among them. That mountain was to be Kangchenjunga, which rises on the border between Nepal and the Indian state of Sikkim. It closed out the list. After it, all 14 giants would be behind him. For Chamoux, this was the finale of 10 years of work, the very point he had lived for all those years. Admittedly, the path to the title wasn't as flawless as he would have liked. Some of his ascents were disputed by Elizabeth Hawley, the chronicler of Himalayan expeditions, whose word decided whether a summit counted or not. The argument was over details. Did he stand on the true top or stop just below it? But for the public and the press, Chamoux was striding confidently toward the title of conqueror of all the giants. And then a shadow appeared at his back. Racing for the same goal was a Swiss climber, Erhard Loretan, a mountaineer of a different mold, cold, calculating, phenomenally fast. The two strongest high-altitude climbers in Europe needed the very same mountain to close out their lists. A silent but tense rivalry rose between them. Who would write his name into history first? In the autumn of 1995, they found themselves on the same slope at the same time. Kangchenjunga became not just a finish line, but the point where it would be decided whose name would sound first. For Chamoux, this finale was far too important to remain only a memory. He conceived a film, the story of how a Frenchman completes a 10-year journey to 14 giants. He wanted the camera to capture the moment he stood on the last summit of his life. The one going to film it was Pierre, not some random man with a camera, but an experienced climber and documentary maker, a longtime partner of Chamoux. He knew how to climb high and how to hold a shot in places where an ordinary cameraman's hands and lungs would have failed. The two of them went toward the summit together, one chasing his dream, the other to turn it into footage. The team was reinforced by 3 Sherpas. On their shoulders rested the loads, the fixing of the ropes, all that invisible work without which such ascents are nearly impossible. And down below, in base camp, the tension was rising. The Swiss, led by Loritan, were preparing for the push, and every step they took was in plain sight. People would later recall that Chamoux was on edge, unwilling to fall behind by a single day or even an hour, constantly checking on what the Swiss rope team was doing. What had been meant as a beautiful, carefully measured finale was quietly turning into a rush. The desire to capture the perfect shot and the fear of being late to the title wove together into a single knot, and it pulled tighter and tighter as both teams got ready to head up. The decisive day came on the 5th of October, 1995. In the dead of night, around 2 o'clock, both teams left their tents and walked off into the darkness. Headlamps stretched in a line across the slope, and the ascent began at the same time, for the Swiss and for the French alike. The way up ran along the southwest face. Enormous altitude, thin air, where every movement comes twice as hard, and thoughts grind slowly, as if through cotton wool. There's almost no room for error here. One wrong move, and the slope doesn't forgive. Around 9:30 in the morning, at an altitude of roughly 8,250 meters, the thing everyone fears happened. One of Chamoux's Sherpas, 33-year-old Riku from the Sankuwasabha district, lost his balance during a short stop. He was sitting with a heavy pack on his back, and at some moment his center of gravity betrayed him. The man broke loose and slid down the steep slope, with no time to grab onto anything. The fall only stopped at around 7,600 meters. Climbing down to the body and recovering it was impossible. Too high, too sheer. The death of their companion instantly changed everything. The 2 remaining Sherpas would go no further. They turned around and descended, shaken by the death of their partner, no longer willing to take the risk. On a human level, you can understand them, but for the French, it was a disaster of a different kind. Up there, at a deadly altitude, with no porters and no ropes fixed ahead, only 2 were left, Chamoux and Royer. The team that had set out before dawn as a single whole had fallen apart by midday, and the mountain began to play with the French by its own merciless rules. Higher up the ridge, in those same hours, a different story was unfolding. Erhard Loritan and his partner, Jean Troillet, were moving confidently toward the summit. The Swiss kept a measured pace, with no extra stops, and their lead over the French rope grew with every hour. Around 11 in the morning, Loritan and Troillet reached the western saddle at 8,350 meters, already the last threshold before the top. They barely paused. At 2:35 in the afternoon, the 2 Swiss stood on the summit of Kangchenjunga. The race, in effect, was won. Loritan was closing his count, beating his rival on the most important of all ascents. Wasting no time, they began the descent. An experienced high-altitude climber knows the iron rule of these mountains. At the top, the climb is only half done, and by that point, your strength is nearly spent. The Swiss hurried down, ahead of the French in both altitude and time, and Chamoux and Royer were still crawling upward. Without Sherpas, without fresh strength, they were losing time on every meter. The lightning-fast final dash had turned into an agonizing, slow crawl, and the day was sinking toward evening. That very difference decided their fate. The Swiss had summited and were heading home while the sun was still high, while the French still had the climb ahead of them, and the hours lost at such an altitude could no longer be won back. Around 4 in the afternoon, on the narrow ridge, 2 rope teams met, moving toward each other. The descending Swiss saw something that boded ill. Chamoux and Royer were still climbing. They were alone, drained to the limit, trudging in the fading light of a day, about to give way to a cold, high mountain night. One more man sensed the danger. The Italian Sergio Martini, who'd been climbing with another team, turned back before reaching the saddle. He was uneasy about the route, a rock tower ahead and a strengthening wind. He trusted his instinct and descended, and Chamoux kept going up, as if he could no longer stop so close to the goal. At 4:30, Royer came on the radio. His words were short and heavy. He was turning back, his strength was gone. The cameraman who was supposed to film the triumph admitted that he could not take a single step higher. An hour later, at 5:30, the voice of Chamoux himself came over the air. He too was at the end of his strength. By his own account, he was about 40 meters below the summit, almost touching the dream of his entire life. But here, right beneath the top, a new misfortune was added to his exhaustion. He couldn't find the way down. In the twilight, the ridge had turned into a labyrinth, and Chamoux couldn't see where to place his foot. By that moment, Royer had already disappeared from view. Before going down, he had given his radio to his partner, as if he sensed that Chamoux would need it more. Now, Benoît was left alone on the ridge, almost at the summit, with a little box of communication in his hands, and no way at all to descend safely into the gathering dark. So began the longest night of his life. 8,350 meters, the zone where the body doesn't recover, where strength melts away with every hour. Chamoux was left without a tent in the icy wind, unable either to climb or to descend. Somewhere nearby, in the darkness, Pierre Royer dropped out of contact as well. On the morning of the 6th of October, around 8 o'clock, the radio came alive again. Chamoux asked Jean Toilet to talk him down, and the Swiss guided him toward the saddle above the 4th camp. Observers saw the Frenchman actually reach the saddle, and then his figure vanished on the northern side of the mountain. The airwaves fell silent. Now, both men were quiet. Down below, a desperate rescue attempt unfolded, but Chamoux's surviving Sherpas refused to go up and search. They hadn't forgiven the fact that after Riku's fall, no one had ever come to help their companion. The team of Michel Pellet reached the 4th camp and found nothing. A helicopter and a plane flew over the mountain from the air, in vain. Only on the 14th of October did Sergio Martini and Abele Blanc, having reached the summit, notice traces of the tragedy near the saddle. In the hardened snow there remained imprints and a bivouac site, a pair of ice axes, Royer's pack with 2 cameras, the safety harnesses, and a radio propped against a rock. Everything except the men themselves. Exactly how it all ended was never determined. Loritan believed the French had fallen from the north face. Martini thought otherwise. They had faded away among the rocks near the saddle, unable to find the strength to climb. The bodies were found neither then nor later. That was how the race between the 2 strongest men ended. Loritan closed his count a little earlier, outlived his rival, and came down alive. Chamoux was only 34, and just one step stood between him and the dream of his whole life, those very 40 meters. Later, his name was given to a foundation that helps the children of Sherpas who lost their fathers in the mountains, and Kangchenjunga once again took its due on the descent, behind the back of the man who had almost won. She reached the 3rd highest summit on Earth, and 2 days later, she vanished on the peak right next to it. Chhanda Gayen, a young woman from a poor Bengali family, the very one who had conquered Everest, stands on the main summit of Kangchenjunga on the 18th of May, 2014. But that isn't enough for her. Together with 2 Sherpas, she heads off toward the western summit of the massif, and on the 20th of May, on the descent, an avalanche sweeps away all 3 of them. Their bodies will never be found. An entire state, led by its chief minister, will be thrown into the search. How did everything collapse in just 2 days? On the 9th of July, 1979, in the village of Kona in West Bengal, a girl named Chhanda Gayen is born. The family lives modestly. There's no money here for sport, for travel, for equipment, and no one in this house ever gives a thought to the high mountains. Chhanda will reach the summits by a roundabout path. First, martial arts come into her life. She trains year after year and works her way up to a black belt. Then she steps over to the other side of the gym herself, becoming an instructor and teaching others, above all young women, simple techniques of self-defense. For her, this isn't a sport. It's a way to give a person who's used to feeling weak the sense of their own strength. Character matters more than where you come from. Willpower is stronger than circumstance. And this idea will become the backbone of her whole life. The mountains come later. Through Bengal's climbing clubs, she tries going up to altitude for the first time, and she discovers a strange thing. What she had spent years drilling on the mat, the ability to endure, to hold a rhythm, not to panic when things get hard, works even better on a slope than it did in the gym. At first, these are training peaks, short practice outings under the eye of more experienced climbers, but she quickly grows tired of that. Inside her, a dream is ripening, a bold one by the standards of her world, to prove that a woman from an ordinary family with no famous name and no big sponsors is capable of climbing where only a handful ever get. This dream will carry her higher and higher toward the most dangerous mountains on the planet. In the spring of 2013, that dream comes true for the first time at the highest point on Earth. On the 18th of May, Chhanda stands on the summit of Everest. She is the first civilian woman from West Bengal to climb to the highest point on the planet. For a young woman who started out in a gym, the achievement is almost unbelievable, but she isn't content with a single record. She has a plan that makes seasoned climbers frown. Instead of descending to base camp after Everest, she means to go straight on, giving her body no time to recover, toward the neighboring 8,000er, Lhotse, 8,516 meters. It's a risky decision. The body is worn out, there's almost no oxygen, and every extra night at altitude drains your strength. On a stretch like that, people die not from a fall, but simply because the body refuses to keep working. And yet, she covers the traverse from summit to summit in roughly 22 hours with almost no sleep, on whatever oxygen is left in the bottles. Among Indians, no one before her had taken 2 8,000ers in a single expedition without descending in between, and done it so fast. In Bengal, they welcome her like a hero. The newspapers write about her, the television shows her. She's given the Shara Avishkar Award. A young woman who once couldn't even afford decent gear becomes a living symbol of female strength. But success opens a chapter far more dangerous than the one before. The higher you climb, the more you're pulled toward whatever is harder still. A year later, she chooses the mountain that will decide her fate. The next goal is Kangchenjunga, the third highest summit in the world, on the border between Nepal and the Indian state of Sikkim. For a Bengali climber, this choice carries a special meaning. The giant stands, in essence, on the threshold of her home region, and to take it means bringing glory to the land that raised her. But Kangchenjunga has a heavy reputation. Most often it kills not on the way up, but on the way down. When the summit has already been reached, the strength is gone, and any help is long hours and thousands of meters below. You can't relax for a single second, and everyone who comes here knows it. Chhanda understands the risk and assembles her team carefully. With her are Indian climbers, among them another woman, Tusi Das. Working alongside them are high-altitude Sherpas, Dawa Wangchu, and Mingma Tenba, experienced guides without whom a route like this is impossible. For her, this climb is more than a personal record. It's a chance to secure her place among India's strongest women climbers and to say once again to thousands of young women, look, it can be done if you don't give up. In the spring of 2014, the team sets out for the foot of the mountain. No one is thinking then that not everyone will come back. May on the slopes of the giant passes in grueling work. Meter by meter, the team moves up the route, sets up camps, fixes ropes, retreats when the weather turns, and then climbs out again. Kangchenjunga doesn't forgive haste. The weather is fickle. A clear morning gives way within an hour to thick cloud and a burst of snow. Above 8,000 meters, the body works at its limit. There's nothing to breathe. The body loses strength even at rest, and every step comes against resistance. Chhanda holds on, and where many would long since have turned back, she pushes on, stubbornly, step by step. On the 18th of May, 2014, exactly 1 year after Everest, she reaches the main summit of the massif. The thing she came here for is done. Below her feet, clouds. All around, the entire Himalayan range. And somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, her Bengal. And here the cruel arithmetic of the mountains kicks in. The summit is taken, but that's only half the journey. On the descent, euphoria dulls your attention, and your strength is already spent. By rights, she should head down at once, while the body still obeys. Most people would have turned back toward base camp, but Chhanda and her 2 Sherpas have a different plan for that day. To the west of the summit she's just reached, another giant rises into the sky, Yalung Kang. This is the western summit of the Kangchenjunga Massif, but it's no mere add-on to it. an independent peak above 8,000 meters with its own route and its own traps. Many climbers spend an entire lifetime preparing for one such ascent. Chhanda decides to take it right away, without going down to rest, using the same chain of summits that a year earlier had made her famous on Everest and Lhasa. Back then, that gamble had brought her glory. This time, it will turn against her. Two people head west with her, Dawa Wangchu and Mingma Tenba. Experienced high-altitude guides, they stay at her side, trusting her decision and taking on the same altitude, the same lack of oxygen, the same exhaustion as she does. The others, including Tusidas, don't go for the new peak. They stay lower, closer to the descent, and from there, they'll watch the ridge along which the three are walking away. The group splits off from the expedition and moves toward Yalungkong along a narrowing snow ridge, farther and farther from any help. On the 20th of May, 2014, the plan comes true exactly halfway. The three climb to the summit of Yalungkong. Another 8,000er is taken, a new line in an already unusual biography. And after that begins the very thing that makes this mountain so dangerous. The group turns to go down already at the end of its strength, and now the weather collapses completely. The sky closes in within minutes, snow pours down, the wind rises, visibility falls almost to zero, and the ridge they were walking along just moments ago vanishes into a white haze. Fresh snow settles on the steep slope layer upon layer, and somewhere up above that loose mass loses its hold. On the western slope, at an altitude of around 7,300 meters, an avalanche breaks loose. The flow races down right where the three are picking their way toward camp and engulfs them all at once. It all happens in a matter of seconds. Those who stayed below see the wall of snow come down, and when it settles, they understand. The three figures on the slope are gone. They call over the radio, and at the top of their voices, peering into the blizzard, waiting for an answer, silence. Chhanda Gayen, Dawa Wangchu, and Mingma Tenba disappear on the western shoulder of Kangchenjunga. Just 2 days have passed since the day she stood on the summit of the massif. News of the disaster creeps downward slowly, as so often happens in the mountains. Only on the 21st of May does the signal about the missing reach base camp by radio. Three swept away by an avalanche on the descent from Yalungkong, no contact for a full day. A frantic rescue attempt begins. The Nepali authorities send up helicopters to scan the slope from above to find any kind of trace, but the mountains seem to close in on purpose. The same foul weather that brought down the avalanche is still raging. Clouds, wind, bursts of snow. The aircraft can't approach the western slope. The terrain is steep and broken, and above 7,000 meters, the capabilities of the machines drop sharply. As early as the 22nd, the air search has to be called off, because flying in such weather means risking new lives. The survivors, among them Tusidas, come down with heavy news. They saw the avalanche come down with their own eyes, and they understand that the odds are melting away with every hour. All they manage to find is an empty slope. The snow has hidden the three of them somewhere at an altitude that neither people nor machines can reach. What began as a brilliant double ascent turns into a search with almost no hope. Far below, in India, a storm of another kind is rising. The story of the missing climber instantly thunders across the entire country. The name Chhanda Gayen is known to millions, and now millions follow every piece of news from the mountains. The Chief Minister of West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, gets personally involved. She takes coordination of the aid under her own control, a rare thing in the case of a missing climber. The state government sends a group to Nepal to help with the search on site. The Ministry of External Affairs and the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute, whose people know these mountains, are brought in. Banerjee declares she's ready to fly to Nepal herself, and she hopes for a miracle. Everything humanly possible is being done. But against an avalanche and foul weather at 7,000 meters, any effort runs into a wall. Chhanda's family lives between hope and despair, clinging to every rumor, to any shadow of a chance that she's still alive. All of Bengal prays for its hero, and the mountains stay silent, and with every hour that silence speaks more and more clearly. The miracle doesn't come. A few days later, the Nepali authorities declare the three of them dead, and the family, worn out by waiting, accepts it. Chhanda was 34, and she was at the peak of her fame. Along with her, The mountains took Dawa Wangchu and Mingma Tenba, the Sherpas who stayed with her to the end and trusted her decision to head west. Triumph on the main summit and death on the neighboring one were separated by only 2 days. The bodies were never found. They're somewhere on the western shoulder of Kangchenjunga, beneath the snow, at an altitude where people rarely return. But for Bengal, Chhanda hasn't disappeared anywhere. A girl from the village of Kona, who had no money, no name, no connections, only stubbornness, made it to the top of the world, and thousands of young women still know her story by heart. The 15th of May, 2019, the third highest mountain on Earth, 8,500 meters up. 2 friends from India had climbed almost all the way to their goal, but they could no longer make it back down. They froze on the slope just as a man who could have saved them was passing by. He stopped. He gave them his own oxygen and waited for hours, hoping someone else would come up from below or down from above. And just a little lower, in the tents of the camp, dozens of climbers were resting. Why didn't a single one of them take even a step upward? And how did a rescue that nearly succeeded end in 2 deaths right at the very edge of life? There were 2 of them, and they were almost inseparable. Kuntal Karar, 46 years old, and Biplab Baidya, 48, or climbers from West Bengal. This is the flat, humid part of India, where there are no mountains at all, yet it raises a special breed of people, ready to give everything for the chance to rise above the clouds. They were bound by a long friendship and a shared, almost painful obsession with high peaks. They came from that same modest world of Bengali mountain lovers that had once raised Chhanda Gayen, without big sponsors and without any right to make a mistake, saving up for their climb over many years. Kangchenjunga was their dream peak, one they had worked toward for a long time, denying themselves a great deal along the way. The third highest mountain on the planet, 8,586 meters on the border of Nepal and the Indian state of Sikkim. For the 2 friends, it was the summit of their entire life in the mountains. They planned to climb it together, just the way they did everything. In the spring of 2019, they finally set out for the mountain. Karar and Baidya headed into the Himalayas as part of a team of 5, and all 5 were from Bengal. Climbing alongside them were Sheikh Sahabuddin, Rudra Prasad Halder, and Ramesh Roy. Fellow countrymen, 1 circle, 1 dream. They would climb with oxygen cylinders and with Sherpa support. Without that help, almost no one survives on an 8,000er. On paper, everything looked carefully thought out. An experienced team, trusted partners, a clear plan. The 2 friends were going to share their triumph the same way they had shared the road to it. They didn't yet know that this mountain charges its price for the descent, not for the climb. The last platform before the summit push stands at around 7,500 meters. This is Camp 4, a scatter of tents on a snowy slope right at the edge of the death zone. Above this, a human being no longer truly lives, only slowly burns through what strength is left. In the spring of 2019, the cramped little platform was unexpectedly packed to bursting. On a mountain that people usually steer clear of, dozens of climbers were crowded around the upper camp. For Kangchenjunga, that is a rare thing. Normally there is almost no one here. On the night of the 14th of May, the 5 Bengalis stepped out of their tents into the darkness. A summit push always begins before dawn, to leave enough time to get back before the weather and exhaustion take their toll. Ahead lay a long route along the ridge and up the snow slopes above 8,000 meters, an endless climb through thin air, where every step costs as much as 10 would on the lowlands. In the death zone, the body does not recover. The heart pounds, the muscles burn through their last reserves, the brain works at half strength. There is no resting here, no gathering of strength. There is only spending yourself further. Every hour up there takes something from the body that will never come back. On this climb, the first signs of trouble began to show in Kuntal Karar. He was fading, falling behind, his body refusing to work the way the altitude demanded. At first, it looked like ordinary tiredness. The sickness creeps in unnoticed, but Biplab Baidya was holding on. Stubbornly, he kept moving his feet through the snow, closer and closer to the point they had both come here for. By the morning of the 15th of May, the friends found themselves at different heights. One was still climbing upward. The other was somewhere below, fighting whatever was wearing him down from the inside. The mountain was beginning to pull them apart, and no one yet understood just how far. At dawn, 4 of the 5 reached the highest point of the route. Biplab, Baidya, Ramesh Roy, Rudra Prasad Halder, and Shaksahabuddin reached the summit of Kangchenjunga. For Biplab, it was the fulfillment of a long-held dream. He stood in the place he had been climbing toward for years. But his friends stayed below. Kuntal Karar never reached the summit. The sickness laid him low earlier, on the way up. Two men who had dreamed of standing on top together were now separated by those final few hundred meters. That same morning, another team was moving across the same slopes. On the mountain was Purja, a former soldier from an elite unit. In 2019, he had launched something that bordered on madness, to climb all 14 of the planet's 8,000ers in 7 months. Kangchenjunga was one of the steps along that route. At 19 minutes past 11 in the morning, Purja stood on the summit with his Sherpas and began the descent. The joy did not last long. The moment they turned downward, everything began to fall apart. On the way down, Biplab was struck by high-altitude pulmonary edema, one of the most dangerous conditions at such heights, when breathing becomes harder and harder. The oxygen cylinders were running out, and as the gas drained away, so too, it seemed, did the very ability to move. And then came another blow. Both men developed snow blindness, damage to the eyes from ultraviolet light reflected off the endless white slope. At altitude, the sun is merciless, and poorly protected eyes slowly stop seeing. A person loses their sight in the middle of a snowy wilderness, in the most dangerous place on Earth. The two of them froze on the slope, unable to take that decisive step downward. Biplab became stranded at around 8,450 meters. Kuntal was lower, at roughly 8,300. They could no longer descend on their own. Without sight and without oxygen, they had frozen into motionless dots on a vast white slope. At that height, a person who stops moving is doomed. The cold and the thin air kill within mere hours. This is where Purja's team found them. Nirmal was descending from the summit together with his partners Mingma, David Sherpa, and Gazman Tamong when they came upon the stranded men. Both Bengalis were without oxygen, both in critical condition. A climber making his own way down from an 8,000er now faced the worst possible choice: pass by or stop and risk his own life. Purja's team stopped. They gave the stranded men their spare cylinders, the very oxygen they themselves might need on the way down, and they began a rescue operation right there, in the death zone, where every effort is paid for with your own life. These were not fresh rescuers who had come up from below. These were men who had only just reached the summit themselves and could barely stand on their feet. They set about hauling down those who could no longer walk. At that altitude, bringing down an exhausted person is almost impossible. He can do nothing to help himself, and beneath your feet is an icy slope. Purja's team began anyway. A long, desperate struggle for two strangers' lives against the mountain, the cold, and their own exhaustion. Meter by meter, the rescuers brought the injured men to Camp 4 and called for help. On the upper platform that night, there were around 50 people, dozens of climbers in their tents, some resting after their own ascent, some preparing for it. With that many people around, you would think help would surely be found. Someone would come out, help carry them, share their oxygen. Help did not come. Purja's team waited 12 hours. 12 hours on the very edge of the death zone, beside the dying, hoping that at least one of their neighbors would climb up. No one came out of the tents. People who had the strength and the oxygen stayed where they were, and the few dozen meters between them and the dying turned out to be impossible to cross. By 10 in the evening, the rescuers brought Ramesh down to the camp, one of those who was still holding on. But for the two friends, rescue no longer reached them. In the early hours of the 16th of May, Biplab Baidya faded away. By Purja's own account, he died in his arms. Right there, in the place to which he had been dragged at enormous cost, at the very threshold of safety. A little later, Kuntal Karar never came around either. He died near Camp 4, just a few steps from the tents he had never managed to reach. The official cause was named as high-altitude pulmonary edema brought on by a lack of oxygen. Snow blindness had stripped both men of any last chance to descend on their own feet, and exhaustion and thin air finished the rest. Biplab had managed to stand on the summit of his dream, and outlived that moment by less than a day. Two men who had been climbing into the mountains together for many years departed within a few hours of each other. Not all 5 of the Bengalis stayed on the mountain. Ramesh Roy and Rudra Prasad Halder survived, but they paid dearly for it. Both suffered severe frostbite. On the 16th of May, they were brought lower, down to Camp 2, and on the morning of the 17th, both were evacuated by helicopter. The 5th, Shak Sahabuddin, made his own way down and safely reached base camp. Of the 5 countrymen who had set out from Camp 4 that night, 3 came home. 2 remained on Kangchenjunga forever. In those same days, they were not the only ones to die on Kangchenjunga. The Chilean climber Rodrigo Vivanco reached the summit on the evening of the 15th of May, and then vanished above Camp 4, having become separated from his group. After his ascent, he simply never reached the tents. In the darkness of the night, on that vast slope, a man dissolved without a trace. No one went to rescue Vivanco. Not a single group set out after him. Everyone was barely managing their own survival. The Chilean was declared dead, and his body was never found. A third death over those days, without witnesses, without explanation. 3 victims in just a few days on a single peak. 2 Indians who faded away right beside the camp, and a Chilean who disappeared alone somewhere above the tents. All 3 had stood at the very top, and not one of them had enough left for the way back. The summit is reached, but the descent breaks off at the point where help can no longer reach. People have long said of Kangchenjunga that the most dangerous part begins once a climber is already celebrating victory and turning down. In those days of May, the mountain proved it once again. The spring of 2019 went down in Himalayan history as one of the deadliest seasons. Around 15 people died on 6 8,000ers. On Everest that year, those famous images of the queues were captured. Hundreds of people in a living chain on a narrow ridge, waiting for their minute on the summit while their oxygen drained away. Traffic jams and a shortage of gas were the common affliction of a season in which there turned out to be far more climbers than the mountain could safely take. Kangchenjunga, where there is usually almost no one, was overcrowded this time too. And here is the paradox. The crowd at the upper camp did not save anyone. It killed. There were people nearby with strength and oxygen, and yet no one climbed up to the dying men, except for Purja's team, who gave away their own cylinders to strangers. When he returned, Purja did not stay silent, and his words were heard around the world. He said it plainly. Both lives could have been saved if even one person had dared to help. It came as an accusation, and once again raised that old, agonizing question. Does a climber have the right to risk himself and his own ascent to save someone else? At 8,000 meters, everyone balances on the edge, and any extra effort can cost a life. Many choose to walk past. Purja's team showed that there is, after all, a choice. Later, this story would make its way into a documentary about his project, and people would argue about it for a long time to come. Kuntal Karar and Biplab Baidya stayed on Kangchenjunga together, the same way they had climbed. 2 friends who had walked the whole path side by side, departed almost at the same moment, 2 steps away from a rescue that was so close and yet never quite reached them. Winter, the north face of Kangchenjunga, the 3rd highest mountain on Earth. At 7,800 meters, there are 3 of them. An American doctor who once climbed Everest, his wife, and their only companion. No oxygen, no team of Sherpas, no helicopter waiting below. Just one last push remains to the summit, and here, a single step from the goal, altitude sickness kills the very man who understood it better than anyone. What is a woman supposed to do, left alone with a frostbitten partner on a wall of ice in the dead of a brutal winter? And how will 4 days of descent turn into a school and a clinic at the foot of the mountain? This is the story of Chandler and Cherie Bremer-Kamp. Chandler comes to the mountains not through sport, but through medicine. He's a doctor from the small California town of Sausalito, a man used to saving lives rather than storming summits. He has no famous athletic background behind him, no titles, no long chase after records. And yet, in the autumn of 1976, the name Chandler is written into the history of American mountaineering. That year, he joins a major expedition to Everest, timed to coincide with the country's 200th anniversary. In the States, they simply called it the Bicentennial Expedition. On the 8th of October, 1976, Chandler, together with his partner Bob Cormack, reaches the summit of Everest by way of the South Col route. They stand on the highest point on Earth. For American mountaineering of that era, this is a milestone. From that day on, people speak of Chandler differently. He's not just a climber, but a doctor, who understands from the inside how the body behaves at extreme altitude and where the line runs between exhaustion and deadly danger. Medical knowledge and the personal experience of a great mountain come together in him in a rare way. From this moment on, the mountains become his life's work, and the next great summit becomes only a matter of time. Within a few years, this path will lead him to one of the harshest walls in the Himalaya, and to a decision that will prove fatal. But the decisive meeting is prepared for him not by Everest, but by K2. In 1978, Chandler joins an American expedition to the second highest mountain on Earth, one that climbers consider far more dangerous than the slopes of Everest. That expedition is remembered not only for the climb, but for the heavy atmosphere within the team, conflicts, arguments, people worn out by one another. Amid those quarrels and that thin air, Chandler meets Cherie Bremer-Kamp, a nurse from Australia, for whom the mountains are not some passing hobby, but part of who she is. They share the same view of risk and of what real mountaineering should look like. Neither of them likes the bulky expeditions with lines of climbers waiting at the summit and endless chains of camps. Cherie becomes his wife and his constant partner on the rope. With her, he shares the line, the tent, and every dangerous pitch. Two medical professionals, husband and wife, tied to the same rope in the middle of an icy slope, a partnership rare even in the world of the great mountains. Together, they begin to dream of a climb of their own, with no extra people and no heavy machinery. They're drawn to lightweight, small-team mountaineering, with no caravans of porters, no safety net made of other people's hands. They want to meet the mountain one-on-one, and the mountain they choose for this meeting matches the dream. Kangchenjunga. The way they decide to climb it sounds almost like a challenge to common sense. They choose winter, and not an ordinary route, but the brutal north face. To grasp the scale of the undertaking, you have to understand what winter Himalayan climbing really means. An 8,000-meter peak is dangerous at any time of year, but in winter it becomes something else entirely. The cold drops far below -40. The wind builds to hurricane force. The daylight is short, and the air is even more frozen and thin than in summer. To climb an 8,000er in winter is to take on the mountain in its most merciless season, and they make the task even harder. They go alpine style, in a small group, traveling light, with no long chain of camps prepared in advance. They don't string a line of stock tents up the mountain. They don't fix miles of rope toward the top. They carry everything themselves and climb in one continuous push, cut off from any support below. On top of that, they go without oxygen bottles and without the Sherpas who normally break trail, fix the ropes, and haul the loads. In the mid-80s, almost no one climbed an 8,000er like this. In winter, up a great wall, without oxygen and without support, and all of it falls on 3 people, a husband, a wife, and a single Nepali companion named Mongol. Behind them, there's no support team above, no string of porters below, only what they carry on their own backs. Every kilogram of gear they haul themselves, at an altitude where even without a pack, each step is a struggle, and no one will break trail through the deep snow for them either. The north face of Kangchenjunga in winter is nothing but ice, bare rock, and wind that never dies down, day or night. There's no help to wait for. Below them lie only empty winter gorges, where at this time of year there isn't a single living soul. With a style like this, there's almost no room left for error. Any serious injury or miscalculation could be the last. The only thing holding them together is complete trust in one another. That's their safety net, and nothing more. And yet all 3 keep climbing higher and higher toward a point from which there will be almost no coming back. From the very first days, the mountain makes it clear it has no intention of letting them through. The cold is so deep that hands go numb even inside thick gloves, and the metal of the gear burns the skin at a touch. They move slowly, chopping steps into the ice and sinking into the snow. The wind tears away the last of their warmth and drives white grit into every gap in their clothing and into the walls of the tent. At night, sleep brings no rest. At extreme altitude, the body barely recovers, no matter how hard you try. It runs on a debt that can never be repaid, and the only thing that can stop it is a descent into thicker air. The higher the rope team climbs, the thinner the line between ordinary fatigue and real illness becomes. By the last few hundred meters before the summit, all 3 are drained to the limit. Only stubbornness and the nearness of the goal carry them forward. But the mountain has already begun to collect its price, and the first to feel it is the one who, of all people, seem to understand best just how dangerous altitude can be. The name of this affliction is high-altitude cerebral edema. As a doctor, Chandler had seen it many times in others, and that makes what follows all the more bitter. From a lack of oxygen, excess fluid builds up in the brain, and it stops working as it should. A person loses clarity of thought, coordination collapses, the body refuses to obey. The sufferer may not even realize how badly off he is. It's one of the leading causes of death on the 8,000ers. There's only one rescue here, to drop altitude as fast as possible. But on a winter wall, there are no oxygen bottles, no backup team, no link to the world below. And so, in the icy silence, Chandler grows worse. They're almost at the goal. The summit is so close. Descending now is as agonizing and dangerous as climbing up. The body can barely hold, and the slope forgives no weakness. The trap is cruel, they can't stay, and they no longer have the strength to go down. And time is working against them. The 15th of January, 1985. The rope team is at roughly 7,800 meters, higher than almost every summit on the planet. Very little remains to the top of Kangchenjunga, with luck, a few hours of climbing. They've come as close as you can come without arriving, and here, at the very edge of his dream, high-altitude cerebral edema finishes Chris Chandler. The illness he understood so well makes no exception for him. At this altitude, in the winter cold, nothing can save him now. Only a loss of altitude could have helped, and there's no strength left for the descent. There's only the wall, the cold, and the minutes slipping away. And so, Chris Chandler fades almost at the very summit he had been climbing toward for years. The man who conquered Everest stays behind on the icy slope of Kangchenjunga. The mountain takes him at the very moment the summit seemed within reach, and beside him remains Cherie. She has just lost her husband and rope partner on an empty winter wall, at an altitude where she herself can barely stand. With her, there is only Mongol, badly frostbitten, almost spent. Before her stands the most terrible choice of her life. To stay by the body means freezing beside it. To leave means descending with frostbitten hands and feet down sheer ice, while dragging the barely living Mongol along with her. Both paths are deadly, and she has to decide now, before what's left of her strength drains away into the cold. And so, two lives come to rest on her shoulders at once. Cherie forces herself to start down. She drags her weakened partner behind her, step by step, tearing herself away from the ice and from the urge to simply stop. The descent stretches into 4 days of struggle in the winter emptiness, and there isn't a single easy minute in it. Her frostbitten fingers stop obeying. Her body fails from exhaustion and cold. Every night they spend on the very edge. But the descent has an ally. With every 100 meters lost, the air grows thicker. Breathing comes a little easier. The chance of survival rises. Slowly they descend toward the foot of the mountain, where the winter void at last gives way to the first signs of life. Help comes from below, from the very people that big expeditions usually barely notice. Sherpas and Tibetans from the villages at the foot of the mountain come out to meet them. They carry both survivors down the steep, ice-covered trails to Gunsa, a high-altitude village on the way to Kangchenjunga base camp. From there, Cherie and Mongol are flown by helicopter to Kathmandu for a long treatment of severe frostbite. Cherie survives, paying for this mountain with the health of her hands and feet. The summit was never reached. Cherie does not hide her terrible experience. She writes a book about it, Living on the Edge. The book comes out in 1987, the winter climb, the death of her husband at the very edge of the goal, and the descent that should have been her last. She travels 3 continents giving lectures about this story, and the money she raises she sends back to where help once came to her, to the villages below Kangchenjunga. In 1989, a 9-room school and a medical post appear in Gunsa. A local monk is trained in the basics of caring for the sick, so that he can treat people in the surrounding villages as a barefoot doctor. And with this, the circle of the story closes. The mountain that took Cherie's husband becomes the place to which she repays her debt through the lives and the health of others. Chris remained on the north face, and his wife's name is now bound not only to a tragedy at altitude, but to a school and a clinic that grew up in the shadow of that very mountain. On the 11th of January 1986, 2 things happened on the 3rd highest mountain on Earth at almost the same time, At 1:30 in the afternoon, two Poles became the first people in history to stand on the summit of Kangchenjunga in winter. And at 11 that same night, lower down the slope, their companion died. Andrzej Czok, one of the strongest high-altitude climbers on the planet. He had been the first to climb Dhaulagiri in winter. He had opened a new route on Everest, but here the cause was not a fall and not an avalanche. It was high-altitude pulmonary edema. There was something that could have saved him, and help was already moving up from below, and still it came too late. How could a single day hold both the greatest triumph and this death? And it all begins in a place where there are no mountains at all. Andrzej Czok was born on the 11th of November, 1948, in Zabrze, in Upper Silesia. An industrial region, the horizon crossed out by smoking chimneys, the ground torn open by coal mines, real mountains something you only see on postcards. Silesia teaches you other things, to endure, to pull heavy work without complaint. Czok would drag those qualities up to altitude with him, where they would prove worth more than any piece of gear. He comes to mountaineering already grown, through rock climbing clubs and the Polish Tatras. It is on that cold granite that the character of the future Himalayan climber takes shape. Silesian climbers grow up tough. There is no money, the equipment is often homemade, and the stubbornness is enough for 10 men. Czok wins people over, not with loud words, but with calm in the face of danger. Where others panic, he methodically hammers in a piton, checks his belay, and keeps going. By the early 70s, he is already known as a man you can rely on along the hardest route. And he does not rise alone. There is a whole wave around him. At the turn of the 70s and 80s, Polish high-altitude mountaineering is living through a golden age that no other country has ever known. While Western teams storm the classic routes with oxygen and an army of porters, the Poles take the hardest walls in the most terrible season of all. It is for that audacity that they earn the name the Ice Warriors. There is not much romance in it. Poland lives behind the Iron Curtain. There is no hard currency. Western gear is out of reach. Down jackets and crampons are often made by hand. And every Himalayan expedition is also a fight for visas and permits. But they have something money cannot buy, the willingness to endure longer than anyone else. As early as 1976, Czok climbs a new ridge on K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, and reaches 8,000 meters. For most people, that is the ceiling. For him, it is the first serious test of altitude, where the body works at the very edge of what is possible. In great mountaineering, there is almost always one partnership that decides everything. For Czok, that partner is Jerzy Kukuczka, a future world legend, one of the greatest climbers there has ever been. Two Silesians from the same harsh land come together as one of the strongest roped partnerships on the planet, and they trust each other with their lives, quite literally, at the ends of a single rope. In 1979, without oxygen, they climb Lhotse, the fourth highest mountain on Earth, and a year later comes the great triumph, Everest. In 1980, they do not repeat someone else's path. They cut their own, up the South Pillar, along a line no one had ever taken before them. You can go up a well-trodden trail, or you can carve your own route on the mountain, one that people will admire for decades afterward. The Poles force a new line through rock and ice and see it through to the end. After Everest, Czok's name stops being only a Polish one, but he never becomes a star. He is still the same calm Silesian, a man who cares about the quality of a line, not the headlines. There is an altitude where it is no longer strength or technique that decides, but the body's ability to keep working while it is starving for oxygen. For most people, this is where the muscles give out and the will goes dark. Not for Czok. He took his giants on his lungs alone, with no mask on his back, in places where others survive only on a bottle. Every step at 8,000 meters without oxygen is a separate labor. The body starves, the mind drifts, and all that is left is to stubbornly move one foot in front of the other. Czok can do this like almost no one else, and he comes back alive from places not everyone climbs down from. He never turns his climbs into a race for numbers. Many of his contemporaries collect summits like trophies, but what Czok cares about is the beauty of the line, not how many, but how. By the mid-80s, he is approaching the most dangerous game of the Polish school, winter ascents of the giants. Here, his cold composure will be worth more than anything else. Right up until the day when, against an enemy of an entirely different kind, it would prove powerless. The The winter assault on an 8,000er became the Poles' signature discipline, one in which they had no equal for a long time. And on the 21st of January 1985, Czok, together with Kukuczka, puts his name to the first winter ascent in history of Dhaulagiri, the seventh highest mountain on the planet. It is no easy thing even in summer. In winter it turns into an impregnable fortress of ice. The cold drops below -40. The wind knocks you off your feet and steals what little warmth you have left in a matter of minutes. Every movement is hard labor. Just standing here for an hour is already a trial, and you have to climb day after day. Czok and Kukuczka hold on, reach the summit, and come back. For Czok, this is the high point of his career. The Silesian boy from Smoky Zabrze is now playing in the top league of world mountaineering, and Winter Dhaulagiri is the ticket to an even bolder idea. The gaze of the ice warriors turns toward a true giant, the third highest mountain on Earth, one that no one had ever conquered in winter. The mountain stands on the border between Nepal and the Indian state of Sikkim and is considered one of the deadliest on the planet. That is the one the Polish team sets its sights on. Czok, fresh from his triumph, does not know that this summit will be his last. In the winter of 1986, a large Polish expedition arrives at the foot of Kangchenjunga. 17 people under the leadership of Andrzej Czok, a fist made of the school's finest. Czok is here, Kukuczka is here, Krzysztof Wielicki is here, names that command respect all on their own. They choose a route never climbed before, on the southwest side of the mountain, and they go in the pure style of their generation. No oxygen and no Sherpas on the upper sections, only their own lungs and their own hands. The tactics are siege tactics. A chain of camps is punched upward meter by meter, through hurricane winds and a cold that turns the very air into a cutting blade. The mountain fights back. No one has ever stood here in winter, and every camp is bought at an enormous price. The Poles crawl stubbornly upward, haul their loads, wait out the storms in their tents, and set out again. By the start of January, the upper group is at assault altitude. The summit is not far now, but it is exactly on this stretch that the mountain begins to collect its toll. Czok is in the upper group, climbing above 7,500 meters. This is the death zone. The body slowly breaks down even in the most well-trained. Sleep does not restore you. Food is not digested. And every extra hour drains strength you will never get back. And then the first warning signs. The breathing grows heavier. A cough sets in. A weakness comes over him that is nothing like the ordinary fatigue of a climb. An experienced high-altitude man cannot mistake a signal like that for anything else. At these heights, the lungs can begin to fill with fluid, high-altitude edema, one of the most dangerous conditions in the mountains. The body stops getting enough oxygen, even though there is as much air around as you could want. There is only one cure: down, immediately, and the lower you go, the better your chances. For a man with edema, every meter shed is worth its weight in gold. But Kangchenjunga is built so that going down those meters costs almost as much as going up. At dawn on the 11th of January, Czok decides to descend. Przemysław Piasecki sets out with him. The plan is simple and the only right one. Lose altitude as fast as possible. But the illness outruns the descent. The breathing grows heavier still, the steps shorter and rarer. Very soon, Czok can no longer move on his own, and his companions are effectively dragging him down over snow and ice, work that wears even a healthy man to his limit at such an altitude. Every meter is paid for with someone else's strength, and with time that is running desperately short. By radio, they keep contact with the doctor in base camp. A rescue group is already on its way up from below, and all their hope is in the oxygen that is supposed to reach them on the way. In the mountains, help is measured not in distance but in hours of the hardest labor. And those hours are ticking against Czok. The oxygen does not make it in time. Czok gets worse with every hour, and he loses the race against the bottle through no fault of his own, but through the cruel arithmetic of altitude. The edema accelerates faster than a man can shed meters or reach safety. At 11 at night on the 11th of January, not far from Camp 3, Andrzej Czok fades away. He was 37. The man who had withstood Winter Dhaulagiri, who had cheated altitude so many times, dies on it after all, without a fall, without an avalanche, simply because at that mark his body could not hold. The altitude to which he had given his whole life proved stronger. Beside him are companions who did everything they could. They brought him down, They kept the radio link. They believed in the oxygen until the very last minute. But against edema on an 8,000er, a man has almost no weapon except the speed of his descent. And it was the speed exactly that fell short. And higher up the mountain, on that same day, the opposite scene is unfolding. Kukuchka and Wilitsky are going for the summit. They do not know that a comrade is dying below them. They are entirely consumed by their own world, the wind, the cold, the hunger for oxygen on those last meters. At 1:30 in the afternoon, they stand on the summit of Kangchenjunga in a temperature of about -35. Wilicki would later call those conditions beyond what either body or mind can bear. But it is done. For the first time in history, a human being stands on the third highest mountain on Earth in winter. A fifth 8,000er taken in the harshest season of all, a line in every chronicle of mountaineering. They descend as victors. The euphoria of the summit is still alive in their movements. And only down below, in the camp, will the truth meet them, a truth that breaks this triumph in two. For now the two men walk down from the top of the mountain, happy, not knowing that the price for the record has already been paid, with the life of their companion. The joy of the summit and the news of the death collide in one camp, in the very same hours. The victory the team had spent a month freezing and risking everything for becomes, in a single minute, morning. That is how this mountain knows how to do things. It strikes not on the way up, but when the goal is almost in your hands. The next day they bury Czok in a crevasse in the ice beside Camp 3. The body cannot be brought down from such a height, and the cleft in the glacier becomes his final resting place, in the heart of the very mountain he had been climbing. The conquerors of the summit come to say goodbye to the man who fell just short, and they stand in silence over the crevasse. In this picture is the whole Polish winter era, greatness and the terrible price for it, compressed into a single day. Kangchenjunga gave the Ice Warriors a record they would be proud of for decades, and in the same breath, it took one of the men without whom that record would never have existed. In Poland, sporting tournaments still carry Czok's name. For the climbers there, he remained the model of a mountaineer, strong, modest, faithful to his style and to his companions. Andrzej Czok left on the day of his team's greatest triumph. He missed this victory by a few hours and a few hundred meters, and yet he became, forever, a part of it, and a part of the mountain itself, in whose ice he still lies, there, in the place he had been climbing toward all his life. On the 3rd of May, 1991, just 150 meters below the summit of the third highest mountain on the planet, the Slovenian climber Marija Frantar freezes before a choice. A few more steps, and she becomes the first woman ever to stand on this slope. Her oxygen has run out, and a storm is rolling in. At 7 in the evening, her radio goes silent forever. Why did one of the most experienced climbers alive, famous for knowing exactly when to turn back, fail to come home? And why, for 10 long years, did not a single woman come down off this mountain alive until the climbing world began, quite seriously, to speak of a curse? This is the story of the thin line between a dream and the abyss, the line where Marija came to a stop. In Ljubljana, on the 29th of March, 1956, a baby girl is born, a girl the whole of Slovenian climbing will one day know by a single short name, Marika. Her full name is Marija Sabolek Frantar, but up in the mountains surnames wear away, and what remains is only that warm, homey nickname. Nobody yet knows that 35 years from now, it is she who will come closer than any woman to a summit that, until her, had let no one near it. For Frantar, altitude was never a way to prove something to anyone else. It was a way to live more fully. By the end of her road, she will have around 600 ascents behind her. 600 times she set out toward rock, ice, and snow, and 600 times she came back. Among the women of her generation, a tally like that is almost unheard of. She climbs in alpine style, fast and light, with no long chain of camps and, most of the time, no extra oxygen. That style forgives no mistakes, but it is exactly what gives her the sharpness she goes to the mountains for. She once put her feelings into words without a trace of bravado. I seek out danger not for the sake of death, but for the sake of life, which is richest and most beautiful up there, on the steep walls and the overhangs. This is my life, and an enormous experience. Frantar wanted to prove something simple. At great altitude, a woman is no weaker than a man. Little by little, She chooses her mountain, the third highest peak in the world, sealed off, brutal, known for taking climbers on the way down, when the goal seems already won. By the start of the 90s, not one of the women who had tried to climb it had survived. That is the mountain Marija decides to go to. To understand how a girl from Ljubljana ended up at the foot of the world's third highest peak, we have to go back 12 years, to the snows of the Pamirs. In 1979, Frantar is no longer just a team member, but the leader of an expedition on Independence Peak, almost 7,000 meters high. She picks no easy line, a new road up the south face, through an icefall. 5 camps, weeks of work, and on the 4th of August, the team is standing on the summit. It is a statement. She knows how to lead people upward. 3 years later, in 1982, Frantar puts together the first Slovenian all-women expedition to Communism Peak, rising to almost 7,500 meters. They go up the north face and the famous Borodkin Pillar. When the team comes down, the Yugoslav women's altitude record is theirs. For the Yugoslavia of that time, this is an event. Women had passed where before only male rope teams had gone. After that, Frantar's name becomes, in her country, a synonym for women's high-altitude climbing. But she is indifferent to fame. The next route interests her far more than any headlines, and she does not rest on what she has done. Every new ascent is a little higher, a little harder, a little more self-reliant than the last. The Pamirs were a step for her, not a finish line. Mountain by mountain, she works her way toward a level where only a handful of summits on Earth remain. The one she wants most is already waiting for its hour. A climber's true character shows in the moment they decide to turn back. In 1986, Frantar leads the first Yugoslav women's Himalayan expedition. The goal is Annapurna South, a mountain more than 7,200 meters high. It is her first serious step into the Great Himalayas, and she goes the way she always has, without oxygen. The team climbs, but at around 6,000 meters, the weather crashes down onto the slope. To go higher means going against the elements, and Frantar chooses to descend. The summit stays unclimbed. For many it would be a bitter defeat, but for her, it is part of the craft. She knows a simple truth. The summit will not go anywhere, and life is given only once. Knowing how to stop, that is her strength. The Himalayas are full of stories of people who never managed to tell themselves enough. They went up while their strength held, and then could not find the way back. Frantar was not one of them, and here lies the bitter irony that no one saw at the time. 5 years later, the woman famous for her ability to turn back in time will find herself in a situation where that very ability no longer saves her. On that mountain, everything will fall out differently than on Annapurna. The team will turn back, but too late. But that is still a few years away. And first comes one meeting that will decide her final rope team. 1990 is the best year of Frantar's career. That is when she steps onto an 8,000er for the first time, Nanga Parbat, more than 8,100 meters, one of the cruelest mountains in the Himalayas. And beside her appears a man whose name is now forever locked to her own, the Slovenian Jože Rozman, a dependable rope partner. Together, they climb the monstrous Rupel face by the Shell Route of 1976, one of the highest walls on the planet. Frantar becomes the 8th woman to climb this mountain and the first to do it by that route. Her partnership with Rozman runs smoothly. He is calm and careful. She is persistent and precise. They complement one another the way only partners can, partners you would trust with your life. That same year, Frantar becomes the first Slovenian woman to climb the north face of the Eiger in the Alps. For these achievements, her homeland honors her with the Blue Deck Award, the highest state honor for sport in Slovenia. But the most important thing Frantar carried out of 1990 was not the awards, it was her bond with Rozman. They had proved to each other that together they were capable of a great deal, and they begin to plan their next big project as a pair. The choice falls on that same sealed-off mountain Marija had set her eye on long before. A year from now, this rope team will walk out onto its snows, full of strength and faith in success. In the spring of 1991, a large international expedition gathers beneath the slopes of that longed-for mountain. It is led by the seasoned Slovenian Tone Škarja, a man with more than one Himalayan campaign behind him. There are 15 people on the team, 11 Slovenians, 1 Croat, and 2 Polish women. It is a strong, tightly knit group, where everyone knows the price of altitude. Among the two Polish members is Wanda Rutkiewicz, a name that in women's climbing rings like a legend. Her path and Frantar's cross here for the first time, and no one then guesses how tightly this slope will bind their fates together. For now, they are simply colleagues working toward one great goal. On the 12th of April, the group sets up base camp. From down here, the mountain looks like an endless succession of snow walls and ice fields running up into the sky. Frantar has a personal goal, one she has suffered for, to become the first woman to climb the main summit of Kangchenjunga. Not a side peak, not one of the neighboring ones, but the main highest point of the whole massif. By that year, the score was merciless. Every women's attempt had ended either in retreat or in death. Not one had come back alive. Frantar knows this. But she also knows something else. Someone has to be the first, or this grim statistic will stay a sentence forever. She prepares for a push that is meant to rewrite the history of women's climbing. Luck comes to the expedition on the 1st of May. The Slovenian Erőss Rupar climbs the central summit of the massif without oxygen, a serious success that gives the whole team confidence. If the mountain is letting them through, the window is open, and there is no time to waste. Frantar and Rozman prepare their own push for the main summit. On the 2nd of May, the rope team climbs from Camp 3 up to Camp 4 to an altitude of about 7,250 meters. Here, on the last platform before the assault, they catch their breath. The plan is simple and risky. Set out at 10 in the evening and climb all night to meet the dawn already near the very top. They will never radio in their departure time, and that will be one of 1,000 small things from which the tragedy will later be assembled. Frantar takes one oxygen cylinder with her, for the worst case, though in her heart she dreams of climbing the mountain clean, on her own strength. Rozman does the same, and above them gathers something they cannot yet see in the dark. Ahead waits the coldest and windiest day of the entire expedition. On the morning of the 3rd of May, the rope team moves fast, but with every hour the pace fades. A westerly storm wind freezes everything alive and does not let up for a single minute. By 3 in the afternoon, they come on the radio, about 150 meters left to the summit. Both oxygen cylinders are already empty, their strength nearly gone. And then an argument flares up. Frantar wants to go up, the dream so close she could touch it. Rozman insists on descending. Base camp advises over the radio to give up the summit and head down at once. A few dozen steps from the goal Marija had walked toward for so many years, they turn back. They head down into the thickening bad weather. But the mountain will not let go now. At 6 in the evening, an alarming message reaches base. They can see nothing and have lost the way. Snow blindness and exhaustion take the last thing they have, the ability to orient themselves at all in the white murk. At 7 in the evening comes the last radio contact. After that, the radio is silent. Night and storm swallow them both. Somewhere above 8,000 meters on a steep slope, the worn-out climbers fall away into the darkness. On the 4th of May, the slope gives up its first find. The Polish climber, Wanda Rutkiewicz, finds the body of Jože Rozman at an altitude of 7,400 meters. The next day, Robert Derjan and Dare Juhant find Marija Frantar a little higher, at 7,500. Both had fallen from above 8,000 meters. Their companions bury them in a crevasse right there on the mountain they never conquered. Frantar was 35. To reach the line in history she had come for, she fell short by one short surge upward. This story has a dark continuation, and it is tied to the woman who found Rozman. Wanda Rutkiewicz, the first woman on K2 and the first European woman on Everest. She had come to Kangchenjunga in 1991 with a personal project of her own, one she called the Caravan of Dreams. A year later, in the spring of 1992, Rutkiewicz climbs this same mountain again. At an altitude of about 8,250 meters, she is seen alive for the last time. After that, no trace. Two of the strongest women in high-altitude climbing lay down on the very same slope, exactly 1 year apart, and still the score would not close. In the autumn of 1994, the mountain takes 2 more. The Russian climber Yekaterina Ivanova dies in an avalanche at 6,700 meters on the night of the 9th to the 10th of October. The Bulgarian climber Yordanka Dimitrova vanishes on the 23rd of October, at an altitude of 8,300 meters, climbing without oxygen. In the climbing world, people began, in earnest, to speak of a curse of women on this summit. The break came only in the spring of 1998. The British climber Jeanette Harrison became the first woman to climb this mountain and come down alive. The spell, which had begun with the death of Marija Frantar, was broken. But behind that first line in history remain the names of those who fell just a little short of reaching it. Frantar sought not death, but life, and she came closer to the dream than any woman before her, and the mountain let the first of them go only 7 years later. Riku, Dawa Wangchu, Mingma Tenba, Fu Dorchi, Bibash Gurung. These names flickered through our collection 9 times and vanished just as quickly. And yet it was these men who went first on Kangchenjunga into the death zone, where they died more often than anyone else. And almost none of them were remembered. Why do we recall the star climbers for decades, while those who paved the road to their records are forgotten by the next season? This is the finale that turns all 9 stories on their head. A look at the mountain from the side that stays in the shadows. On the 3rd highest peak in the world, as on any 8,000er, other people's records are made by other people's hands. It is rarely said out loud. When someone climbs Kangchenjunga and his name lands in the chronicles, behind that name there is almost always a chain of other people. They went first. They fixed the ropes on the sheer pitches, broke trail through deep snow, carried up the tents, the food, and the heavy oxygen cylinders. They are called high-altitude Sherpas, and almost no one remembers what their names were. History records the star climbers in detail: the year, the route, the style, the last words over the radio. Those who prepared the way for them, it rarely keeps in mind, at best, a single line on a list of the dead. For 9 stories we looked at the mountain through the eyes of those who pushed for the summit, for a crown of 14 8,000ers, for a first ski descent, for a women's record. Now, through the eyes of those who worked the slope day after day, and who were buried not only by avalanches, but by oblivion. This story is not about a single hero. It is about an entire people who carry other men's triumphs on their backs and pay for every ascent, even though they never sought any glory for themselves. But first, who are they really? The Sherpas are a small people, around 150,000 of them, living in the northeast of Nepal, at the foot of the highest mountains on the planet. Their very name translates literally as people from the east. 5 centuries ago, their ancestors crossed the ridges from the Tibetan region of Kham, fleeing turmoil and searching for new pastures. Several clans came down into the valleys of Solukhumbu and founded settlements that still stand there today: Namche Bazar, Kumjung, Tam, Pangboche. They were herders and traders, not conquerors of peaks. For a long time, the high mountains remained, to them, the dwelling place of the gods. But centuries of living at altitude, where the air is thinned to the limit, did something to their bodies that no training could ever achieve. Their blood and muscles spend oxygen more sparingly, their vessels feed the tissues better, their hearts handle the strain more calmly in places where a newcomer gasps with every step. What is a lethal zone for a European is, for someone born in these valleys, a familiar environment. Nature gave them an advantage that, in the 20th century, turned into a profession. When the first great expeditions came to the Himalayas, they needed people able to haul loads to places where the climbers themselves could barely stand. And so, the word Sherpa took on a second meaning. Today it means not only a people, but a job, a high-altitude porter, a guide, the man who goes ahead and carries another's burden on his own back. Many of those called Sherpas on the mountain belong, by blood, to other Nepali peoples, the Gurungs, the Tamangs, the Rai. But the profession fixed a single name on all of them, and a single fate: to be the one who makes the mountain passable for others. By the time a client takes his first step up the route, the main part of the climb has already been done. The road was prepared in advance. The ropes are fixed on the ice walls, the camps are pitched in steps up the mountain, the oxygen bottles have been carried up and hidden under the snow at the right altitudes. All of this is done by hands you usually don't see in the celebratory photographs. The high-altitude workers cross the most dangerous sections not once, but again and again, until the trail becomes safe for those who paid for the climb. And here lies an invisible injustice. The client crosses the icefall or the avalanche-prone couloir twice, going up and coming down. The Sherpa crosses that very same stretch 20-30 times in a season, carrying loads up and down. Every extra trip is another throw of the dice, an avalanche, a serac collapse, a hidden crevasse beneath the snow. The odds of not coming back, for the man who works, are by simple arithmetic several times higher than for the man being led. The pay for that risk is small. A high-altitude porter earns somewhere around $100 and a little more per climbing day, money considered good in mountain Nepal, and, set against the risk, worth almost nothing. In peak season, on Everest alone, 300 or 400 such men are hired. On Kangchenjunga, there are far fewer teams, and the porter's work here is lonelier still, even less visible, which is why, in the grim statistics of the mountains, their names appear disproportionately often. Without them, commercial Himalayan mountaineering simply would not exist. But the labor that holds up the whole industry stays invisible. It is noticed only when it ends in death. Then a name appears and immediately begins to fade. Autumn of 1995. An expedition led by the Frenchman Benoît Chamoux is moving up the eastern slope of Kangchenjunga. He is chasing his last, 14th peak, with a Swiss rival climbing close on his heels. Several Sherpas are working alongside Chamoux. One of them is 33 years old, from the Sankuwa Saba district in eastern Nepal, and his name is Riku. That day, at an altitude of around 7,600 meters, something happens that, in the mountains, is called a freak accident. Riku sat down to rest without taking the heavy pack off his back. The weight of the load tipped him. He lost his balance and fell. The fall was fatal. The two other Sherpas who were with him immediately started down, leaving Chamoux and his cameraman without support on the hardest part of the route. Riku's body remained on the route, and here the story grows especially hard. In the days that followed, people kept moving along that same trail, up toward the summit, down to the camp, past their dead comrade. No one stopped to bring him down off the slope, and when Chamoux himself and his cameraman vanished on the descent, and the question of searching for them arose, the surviving Sherpas refused. They did not go to look for the Frenchman. It was not cowardice. It was the silent protest of men who could not forgive that no one had tried to save their own, Riku, or even to bring him down off the route. To those who saw the Sherpas as nothing more than labor, the refusal looked strange. To the Sherpas themselves, it was the only way to say out loud, "Our man was worth going back for too." Riku's name stayed in a few lines of the chronicles of that race. About the Frenchman, books were written. About him, almost nothing. 19 years later, in May of 2014, the same asymmetry repeats itself almost word for word. The Indian climber Chhanda Gayen is going up the mountain, a symbol of women's strength in West Bengal. Having reached the main summit, she pushes on with almost no rest toward the western peak of the massif, Yalung Kang, a neighboring 8,000er. With her are two high-altitude Sherpas, Dawa Wangchu and Mingma Tenba. They carry the loads, they belay, they break trail. On the descent, at an altitude of around 7,300 meters, the western slope gives way. An avalanche catches all three at once, the climber and both of her companions. The snow carries them down and buries them where they fall. Helicopters search for 2 days, but bad weather wrecks the effort, and no bodies are found. The mountain keeps for itself both the star and those who walked beside her. And then, everything as usual. The death of Chhanda Gayen is written up in India's newspapers. The search is coordinated personally by the head of an entire state, who sends a team to Nepal. Her name becomes a national loss. And the names of Dawa Wangchu and Mingma Tenba sound quieter, 2 short lines in the report, like a footnote to the main story. 2 Sherpas died with her. These 2 men had families, homes in mountain villages, children waiting for them to come home. But in the public memory, they remained an appendix to someone else's biography. The difference between a star and a porter is not made by the avalanche or the slope. It is made afterward on the ground, when it is decided whose name goes in the headline and whose is folded down into a footnote. The mountain takes equally, memory does not. There is a third day, the one from which, in essence, this whole collection began. May of 2013, one of the deadliest single days in the history of the mountain. 5 never came back from the route that time. 2 Hungarians, a Korean, and 2 Nepalis. The Hungarians were going toward their own dream, the Korean toward his. The two Nepalis were on the mountain for work. Their names were Pudorchi Sherpa and Bibish Gurung, and they stayed on the slope where death found them. Their names landed on the general list of the dead that season, but after that the paths of memory diverged. About the Hungarians, in time, a documentary film was made. The story of a widow was told. About the Korean, it was written at home as a loss for national mountaineering, and about the two Nepalis, almost nothing remained, only a line in a report and a dry note about their occupation. This is not malice and not anyone's fault. It is the way the whole system of attention is built. The viewer is drawn to those in whom he recognizes himself, the person who left home and set out for an unreachable goal. The porter doesn't fit into that romantic frame. He is on the mountain not for a dream, but for a wage. And so his death seems ordinary, almost a workplace matter. Though in essence it is no different, the same cold, the same altitude, the same avalanche. It's just that romance needs a hero with a dream, not a worker on a shift. What is this life worth, in figures? For the death of a high-altitude worker, the family receives a mandatory insurance payout, around 1.5 million Nepali rupees, roughly $16,000. The sum was only raised after the ice avalanche of 2014, which took 16 porters on Everest in a single morning. Beyond that payment, there is almost no social protection, and a widow in a mountain village is left alone with her loss and her children. That tragedy became a turning point. For the first time, the Sherpas openly demanded justice, proper insurance, and the right to refuse a deadly risk. There appeared, too, rare examples of a debt repaid. The foundation named after Benoît Chamoux helps educate the children of fallen Nepalese, and Cherie Bremer-Kamp, once rescued on this very slope, built a school and a medical post in the village of Gunsa. But these are exceptions. More often the price is paid in silence, and just as silently forgotten. If you now look back over the whole collection from this side, the picture turns over. Behind every name in the headline stands a chain of those left in the footnote. Rutkiewicz, Chamoux, Stitzinger, Gayen went where the road had already been laid. Those who laid it were Riku, Dawa, Wangchu, Mingma Tenba, Fu Dorchi, Bibash Gurung. The mountain does not divide the climbers into stars and porters. That division is made by the living, by those who remain to write the chronicles. Kangchenjunga was never fully conquered. Its very summit was left untouched, out of respect for a sacred place. The respect owed to those who died for another's triumph, it still lacks. And perhaps the greatest ascent of all is to give these people back their names.